Bom dia a todas e todos. Prazer receber a todas e todos vocês aqui no Cebrap, né? O pessoal de fora, o pessoal de dentro. Vamos fazer mais um seminário da casa. Hoje um seminário especial, presença de um convidado internacional, né? Gerry Bloom, que é um grande especialista em sistema de saúde, cobertura de sistema de saúde, em estudos comparativos em diferentes países, e que lidera há algum tempo, que trabalha no IDS, que é um parceiro do Cebrap já de bastante tempo. Nesses quase 50 anos que o Cebrap vai fazer no ano que vem, o IDS já está na parceria com o Cebrap já, não sei o tempo exato, a Vera depois pode me dizer, mas já faz aí bastante tempo, né? Desde os primórdios, né? Desde antes de eu entrar no Cebrap, e olha que já faz tempo que eu entrei. Então é um prazer ter o Gerry aqui. Ele vai fazer a apresentação dele em inglês, vai fazer uma apresentação aí de em torno de meia hora, 40 minutos, depois a gente passa para o debate, tá? E depois nós teremos o lançamento do boletim com o Alex, também nosso parceiro de muito tempo aqui no Cebrap, o boletim Accountability for Health Equity, Galvanizing a Movement to Universal Health Coverage. So Gerry, it's a pleasure to have you here, and the presentation is Mutual Learning for Universal Health Coverage in a Rapidly Changing World. So it's an honor to Cebrap to have you here, and thank you for your presence and for your presentation.
Well, first, it's a real honor to be here, and of course I've worked with Vera for many years now, and I've been hearing about Cebrap. It's a long-standing partnership, but it's a pleasure to be here and to exchange ideas with people. This year seems to be the year of anniversaries. So it's the 70th anniversary of the founding of the British health system, the 40th anniversary of the Alma-Ata Declaration, the 30th anniversary of the founding of the Brazilian health system. So somehow, in a year of anniversaries, it helps to think a little bit, to reflect a bit. What's similar and what's changed over all these years. And so I put here, and we'll talk about 40 years and 3 global health narratives. And I guess to hint where I'm going is that there's some real changes that we've experienced. And I think it brings some interesting challenges to ourselves as either research institutes or think tanks about how learning in terms of global health can happen compared to the past. So I put here first 1978, the Alma-Ata Declaration. Sort of around the year 2000, the discussion of scaling up and the Millennium Development Goals, and now the plan to launch Alma-Ata 2.0 later this year. So first, Alma-Ata Declaration. And these are really potted histories, and I'm happy for you to challenge them or ask questions. But Alma-Ata Declaration, I mean, that really was in the post-colonial period or post-revolutionary period with Soviet Union, China, Vietnam, and reflected some kind of global political consensus. In a meeting in the Soviet Union, in almost all countries, there was a model of development that was state-led, and it's not surprising that as state-led development was seen to be the dominant model all around the world, that state-led development of a health system was how it was seen. The focus actually in reality afterwards was mainly to build infrastructure, train health workers, strengthen a few public health programs, and yes, to support some aspects of community participation. And I can't help, just for our memories, to think of the kind of goals that were set. So we're now in 2018. It was going to be health for all by the year 2000. In the year 2000, there wasn't health for all. And at that point, it's hard to think back now, but really at that point, after the fall of the ending of the Soviet Union, there was a view that we really had a unipolar world, And people talked about the global community as if it was one, and not surprisingly, its headquarters was in, well, notionally in Washington, practically probably in New York City. And this was how the global community then had ideas about achieving, well, in this case, eradicating extreme poverty by 3 years ago. The real talk then was about increasing funding, mainly as aid, and a lot of discussions about rules for aid management. And then the thought was we need to strengthen governments to provide a package of services that will be funded through aid. And there was a talk of transfer of institutional models. And I put this here because I couldn't help sharing a conversation I had. Yeah, I'll even say for those who have their own prejudices, it was in Belgium. And people were earnestly talking about whether the European model or the American model would be the model for modernization around the world. And of course, this was in Belgium, and there was a real sense the European model was the right one. It's hard now to think back that people could have a discussion like that. And institutes of global health, I mean, it's interesting that how many institutes of global health have now been created. They would provide learning on health system strengthening, which is really on how do you successfully transfer institutional models that clearly work in Europe and ought to work in other parts of the world. And this would be a mechanism of scaling up health services and eradicating extreme poverty. Now, this goal was reached, but it was reached mainly because of what happened in China, which I guess is the next part of the story. And this is important about how we think about learning. The real thought around then is, well, it doesn't make sense. There's all these health things that we know are cost effective. We know we could substantially improve health, and all we need to do is take these interventions and take them to scale. And I just took from the WHO, and it's important to think of that word building blocks. The kind of metaphor was, the problem is we don't have a health system. We need to build it. You build it with blocks. Sounds like Lego. And you know, we had to have service delivery, health workforce, health information systems, a series of blocks. And if we only assembled them and put in money, out would come good health. And that was how things were seen by the global community in the year 2000. So far the story is one of quite calm and peaceful movement towards better health. Now I put this, and it's a reflection now in 2018, thinking about our world, compared to the world as it appears in the Alma Ata Declaration or in this view of building blocks. And in a way, it's very appropriate, I'm saying this in Brazil, with how people are now experiencing the challenge of change. I mean, what we've seen in the world over the past, certainly 15 years, is changing patterns of economic development. Some areas have experienced sustained growth for 25 years, are becoming quite quickly middle income, upper middle income countries. Other areas are stagnating. I'm in Europe, where there's actually been a problem of stagnation now for a decade. The stagnation and the growth can be, the differences can be within countries. So there are areas of economic growth where parts of the country are as part of whatever we mean by the modern developed world, and parts that are still struggling. And of course we have differences between countries. And after that sustained boom of the 90s and 2000s, we are surprised to discover that we have economic shocks. And so sometimes health system development is in a period of economic growth, and sometimes it's challenged. We have rapid urbanization and population aging, and of course the effect this has on the pattern of ill health and the pattern of needs. And in general, with all these changes, rapid movements to cities, rapid economic growth, shocks, there are new patterns of inequality, exclusion, and health needs. So when the Alma Ata Declaration was written, a poor person was basically a woman. Basically, she was growing and processing organic food. It was in the countryside. And all of Alma Ata is aimed at making her life a little better. Well, patterns of inequality, exclusion, and health need are hardly about those people anymore. They're quite different people that are having problems, and their way of dealing with solving life's problems are different. There's been, I put here, a shift in roles of individual and health system. It's increasingly the problems are chronic, and clearly health systems themselves can't solve all the problems, and people increasingly are taking responsibility for health issues. There's technological change. I mean, there's been advances in diagnostics and therapeutics, and that's led to capacity to solve more health problems, and it's increased expectations. And there's been, most dramatic now, the spread of information technology, and with the potential of radically changing how health systems operate. There's been changing roles of government and non-government organizations in the health sector. At the time of Alma-Ata, basically government was going to build a modern health system. At the time of the global community, yes, there were international NGOs that would use donor money, and we're all familiar with them. But now we're seeing quite different realities about how people are solving health system problems. Ecological change and health problems. I think we have to increasingly put this in the change and how it's changing reality. We've had emergence of new infectious diseases. We know climate change is going to have impact, and we also have big problems with environmental pollution, with the new urbanization and industrialization. And we've had big changes in communications and media, and basically rises in expectations. So people who are thinking about health systems are now in a world that is very, very different from the period of Alma-Ata. But our imaginings of what we need to do in health systems seem remarkably similar to those in Alma-Ata. And I think we have to think, what does this mean in this world with this kind of change? And the other big change in the world that we have to acknowledge is our new sources of global innovation. The view, even in 2000, innovation would happen probably in the United States. And then it would be transferred around the world. I mean, we now have new centers of technological innovation, and I think China is the most obvious, but it's not the only one. And it's not just now that we're getting governments in China or India investing substantially on research and development, but we have global corporations now that are coming out of there, some of the most innovative. And I put pharmaceuticals, I guess we all know, particularly Indian pharma, diagnostics and information technology. We're really talking about Alibaba as a source of global innovation now. So we have to see innovation is now coming from different places. Meanwhile, countries, and Brazil is one of them that's taken the lead, the experience of meeting needs of all social groups where we have rapid development and rapid change. There's now 30 years, 40 years of experience that's been gathered on how we deal with these kinds of massive changes. And yes, I put major health and welfare system reforms, particularly now in the global context in Brazil and China, are amongst the biggest and the most influential. So whereas we could think about ideas flowing from Harvard to the rest of the world, it's a remarkably implausible view of how solutions to global problems are going to be found now. I hope Alma-Ata 2.0. I think this is another big global change, and I think it's worth thinking about what this means. First of all, the Director General of the WHO is a very senior African politician. He may be a good politician or a not good politician, but he's a politician leading WHO. The top priorities are health security and universal health coverage. We can get to that. He's actively seeking new sources of finance, and sees that the legacy of basically aid-funded WHO programs as a benefit, but also a problem for the future. He's giving high priority to engaging with the BRICS countries. And I thought it's worth sharing this with people here, that where they put their strategic plan, they now define 4 kinds of country engagement. Which is very different to the model of 2000, when it was, how do we get poor countries to use aid money to catch up? There are policy dialogue partners who I guess he sees as ones who will participate in the discussions of how do we solve problems. There are strategic supporters, who I think he sees as the key ones, who are going to be particularly the larger countries who have solved quite a lot of health problems, but still have a lot they want to do to improve their health sector, but are becoming increasingly sources of global knowledge on health, solving health problems. They're technical assistance partners, where WHO would still be providing technical assistance for building health systems, and a very small number of post-conflict areas where WHO might be involved in service delivery. But this sense of what is WHO is very different. And I put here, what is the, oh, and yes, 2030 for universal health coverage. Again, an ambition. But a question I want to ask is, what is an appropriate approach for organizing learning in this context and in this country? Okay, I will go a little quicker. Basically, we're talking about adapting health systems to rapid, and I would suspect, accelerating change. So we're never going to be reaching that goal of the well-developed health system with a clear set of health needs, because every time we get there, the health needs are going to change, and the relationship between public and private is going to change. So we're going to have a wide variety of public and private providers of services, and governments need to adapt new strategies to influence health system performance. That model that they will decide where the health system goes and the health system will follow the leaders is becoming less and less plausible. For all sorts of reasons we come to. We need new kinds of partnerships for disease management, which means we'll have health facilities, community groups, individuals, and public and private actors will all be playing a role, and we need a government capable of working with them and strategizing change with them. We need partnerships for regulation and accountability, and we've been discussing that governments on their own are not that great at getting a very complex system like the health system to work well, and we need new kinds of partnerships. And this brings up the real issue of the politics of health and health system change, and how do we meet the expectations, to be honest, not just of the poorest, because look how WHO is framing itself, but of all social groups. What are they needing of a health system and a government, and how do we balance all of that? Which leads to a capacity for strategic leadership. And I guess I'm still coming back to how do we get learning about that capacity. Well, I work in China, so I put a slide about China. But I think the question really is, how does this country manage an impossible transition, really? And I was involved in a large project in China for years, and at a certain point, it was World Bank. They had an external review, and it was led by an American, had Chinese on it, and it concluded the project was unimplementable. Everything was so out of equilibrium that it was impossible. And I think the point is about China is they've had to implement the impossible. And I guess what I would say about the world that's coming, we're going to have climate change, we're going to have rapid continuing urbanization, population aging, we're going to have bigger economic shocks, and we're going to have climate shocks. Basically, it's impossible. So how is the impossible going to be managed so that it becomes the new possible? And I think that's the big question. In China, the way it worked, and certainly in health, is there was a whole period of identifying emerging problems about people basically not getting access and all the problems of a badly organized system. They scan the horizon, and they have very little post-colonial worry for available solutions in other countries. And then on the base of it, their intellectuals really working with the health sector formulated potential strategies to address problems. But the key is they would then, because no one knows if it's going to work, encourage local governments to test them. And so there's a lot of experimentation in China, a lot of trying new things. They monitor the outcome of experiments and formulate policy based on the outcome of experiments to reduce risk. At a certain point, government says it's time to implement, and all localities implement, but with a high level of decentralization. So a high level of ability to adapt. And then monitoring the outcomes, and they've increasingly been using researchers and think tanks to say what's working, what doesn't, and a recognition that the solution to every solution brings new problems, and you're not going to solve everything. and then modify policy on the basis of findings, and now I think increasingly funding people to keep identifying emerging problems. So it's an iterative process of taking a very, very unsatisfactory health system, enabling it to become a little bit more satisfactory before all the other changes taking place outrun the health system, and then the pressure comes again. I guess the other message here, and it's part of the new reality, is China has announced the Belt and Road Initiative is talking about its public and private investment of somewhere around $1 trillion over the next few years. China is becoming increasingly engaged in global health, and this way of learning by doing is likely to become a key element of what global health looks like. Okay, a couple of thoughts, because we're heading towards a conclusion. The thing is that, and if we look at China, there isn't a knowledge of where you're going, and it's quite hard even to know how everything adds up in any particular situation. So the question then becomes, how does every locality have to deal with all this complexity on their own, or is there a way people can learn? Can we find ways through this impossible situation that everyone is coming to? How do we build systematic knowledge about what has worked and why, and how can we help other people experiment? You need to establish opportunities to exchange experiences between researchers, but even more important, health sector leaders and government officials in different localities. I certainly know in China, that's the way that they had such an accelerated reform, and it's mind-boggling to think that in introducing rural health insurance, they went from maybe 10% of coverage of rural population to about 95% in about 10 years. But there is experience in China, and I suspect in Brazil, about how reforms can happen through experimentation and then sharing learning across provinces, across municipalities. It's harder to enable learning between countries and to get below the surface. And part of what we've been thinking about, and I think it'd be useful for you to think about, is how does that happen? How can 30 years of learning in Brazil, aside from helping you solve some problems, make dealing with rapid urbanization and health system change a little less painful in other countries around the world? And we need to build long-term links for new types of learning about adaptation to change, and that may be a message to give to the WHO if they want to move in that way. I'll put a couple lessons from ID experience, and we'll get to the end. We sort of thought this is a problem. We invited people as in senior international associates. One of them is here from Brazil and from China, and we asked them just to think about what are some of the key lessons. I think they both did some pretty interesting thinking. We had joint panels and intensive meetings. We've had them in China. Actually, I was at one in Geneva. We had it in the UK. They were very interesting. But basically, it didn't lead to major learning for change at scale. I think obviously one has to think bigger to how to solve the problem. We now have linked with our local city government. And Brighton faces problems not so different, of limited resources, increasing numbers of elderly. It's really looking for ways to reform an extremely conservative system. We actually brought a young Brazilian doctor who's here and spent time with them. And I have to say, we asked them to do us a favor, and they were grateful. It may be partly his personal characteristics, but actually their problem is that inside the system, they feel like they have no time. And it allowed them, by thinking about another place, to actually try to find some different ways of tackling their problems. We've set up a partnership with a Chinese think tank, and we had visits also by Chinese policy analysts, and to both the city government, and we have our jargon, to the group that's mainly involved with commissioning paying for health services. And then, since that was going well, and the city government is seeing itself in the UK as being a place where people from different countries will meet and solve problems, they were very keen to organize a meeting, and they brought a lot of their senior officials to meet with Chinese policy analysts and government officials. Also a large social enterprise from China, and basically had a very, very engaged meeting, and we came up with plans for a program of mutual learning, which were, if you look at it, are the kind of things governments have to worry about. Actually, the Chinese are particularly interesting as how do you make commissioning of non-government organizations? How do you do it? The British side, as much as the Chinese, have a real problem of integrating welfare and health services. So looking at practical problems, how have people solved it in other countries? And people were very interested in the use of information technology. And I think the issue is really the need to build links between governments who are really adapting to change and between researchers to help learning. This is just to show the UK is changing. I put this here because I was invited to meet what is called NHS International. And the British government, particularly because of Brexit, which I'm sure even over here you've heard about, has a bit of a worry about how does Britain engage with other countries in the future. Britain sees itself as having a health system that is recognized highly around the world and would be a point of contact with other countries. I think what comes out of a discussion with, and of course they previously had the view that they had an answers to some health service problems and they would share it with others. But I think what comes out of what's happening now is, first of all, we have to recognize the speed of change. There aren't 10 years to slowly bring an NHS to another country. We can transfer some specific technical skills or even some particular organizational arrangements, but often they have to be adapted. And Britain itself is having to make major changes because of the economic changes and particularly demographic changes. So I think we're saying, and I think there's an increasing understanding in the health system that there's a need to build partnerships between government agencies and regulatory authorities. Partly to build trust and mutual understanding, partly because increasingly regulatory issues are global. And so it's actually very useful for a regulatory agency to have ongoing relationships with their counterparts in other countries. And from a British government point of view, and probably from a Brazilian government, it's only when you have these mutual understandings and one can talk about how we've used our local companies that some practical ways of talking about trade might happen. What comes out of it is that partnerships in the UK and other countries need to be constructed on the basis of mutual benefit. And we're thinking about, and also partnerships around solving mutual problems are probably the best basis for discussions about global health, where there are global issues. Now, what I wanted to do now is just hear some thoughts. Something very interesting has happened in the UK, which is really government responsibility for health has moved across different ministries. Now what's called the Department of Health and Social Care, the focus is mostly on strengthening UK health and social care, but British engagement in certain global issues, and particularly around health security and around antimicrobial resistance, are led by the Ministry of Health. On the other hand, Britain's engagement with low-income countries is managed by the Department for International Development. But the broader issue of British engagement internationally is managed by the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So 3 ministries are involved. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs is now supporting what it's calling the Prosperity Fund, which is largely about building relationships of mutual economic interest. But I think with some understanding, particularly in health, that can't simply be taking a British company to another country, but that you need long-term relationships of mutual trust and benefit. And they are going to be supporting such a program in Brazil. Alex, who knows a lot more about it than me. But I think the question I wanted to ask in the end, in this changing world, is what kinds of partnerships would city governments in Brazil find useful? That would be useful to them and useful to others. What are the benefits for Brazil or that government, city government? And what can Brazil's experience teach in this world of Alma Ata 2.0, or Brazil as what they call it, a strategic partner of WHO? What countries or cities would be appropriate partners? Now, I said mutual learning is difficult. It's not just a question of getting government officials to sit down and meet each other every now and again. They will enjoy each other's food, but probably won't change much about what they understand. What's the role of think tanks like Cebrap and IDS in enabling that kind of mutual learning? And yes, what are the next steps? So I'd welcome your thoughts and reflections. Did any of what I said ring true in terms of what the world is looking like? And what does this mean for changing our roles? Thanks.
Thank you, Gerry. So I think you can just open the debate. Maybe a gente pode fazer em português e depois... mas quem quiser fazer em inglês também diretamente. Fica... aí talvez o Alex ou a Laura ajudar.
I think, and I would say Alex and I share a lot of these thoughts, so I'm happy for him to participate.
Então, depois você já fica aqui também. Então...
So I'm going to ask in English. I have a question about the nation state. You said that in the Alma Ata Declaration, people talk about state-led initiatives as a key resource. And you presented the example of China, which is a strong state-led economy. And so I think that the problem is that nowadays, these big policies like health are framed from a neoliberal point of view, in which the solutions are seen as goods or commodities that must be bought in the market and not as rights to be delivered by the state. And so we can think about the example of Brazil nowadays, because there was a very important political shift in 2016. And one of the principles of this shift is the reduction of the state. And some people nowadays in Brazil, some people talk about the national health system as something that doesn't work anyway, and so it should be abandoned completely. And we could think about the example of the UK too, with the slow erosion of the NHS. So my question is, how do you see this issue of the role of the state? And I think this is important because nowadays people tend to talk about these things without considering issues like democracy and social justice that must be considered too.
Maybe we can have 3 questions and one. Or you can start to answer now. No, maybe you can start.
I think I can add to this question. If you have some kind of learning conclusion that you made about the role of the private and the role of the public system, I know it's a big question, but if you have any data or at least some kind of something that you already have as a knowledge that is established in terms of at what point the public system can go and the private system can go.
To make a round to complete the...
Just big questions. No easy questions.
There is some interference. Remind me once we received a visit of a Chinese mission to Fiocruz, and they said they were coming to Brazil to learn about the public health system. And the leader of the mission said, because in China we had one public system that we opened to private. And we create a big trouble that to open to private is a way with no coming back. It's very difficult. Do you think this is a lesson to learn?
I'm not, okay. I will take the obvious route out of this. I guess my first comment, and it's actually said to make people think, is that we're in a world dominated by the neoliberal paradigm. Now I'm watching the news, and it's not what I'm seeing. What I'm seeing is an increasingly powerful China, and they never, I'll come back to your question. I mean, they have a powerful state, but they also have powerful corporations. Those powerful corporations, I have to say, the state or the Communist Party influences who is the CEO. So they're not totally separate, but they're not integrated. I'm not really making a judgment of good or bad, but I think that feeling of things falling apart and it being neoliberal, I think you should watch the news and the president of the country who is embodying that consensus. Actually, we're in a world that's changing. And increasingly, the model in global health that people are going to point to is China. For no other reason, because they're going to invest $1 trillion in the Belt and Road Initiative. But the other thing about China is in global politics, for a number of years, they have been the one against intervention and for protecting national sovereignty. So I would expect national sovereignty to become a much more important concept over the next few years, whatever that means. Whatever that means. About public and private, and again, I'll use China. There is no doubt, I don't see the reform quite that way, but there is no doubt that China, in trying to manage transition, had a lot of problems that emerged in the health sector. And they weren't actually about private, but they were about the incentives that health facilities had. They were government-owned, but acted private. And so there's a sense that the state has to be quite strong as a steward and as a regulator of the health sector. What that means versus public and private, I can only go to what I would predict is who the key private players that you're going to be concerned about in 5 years. They're not pharma, and they're not private service delivery companies. In this part of the world, it's more likely to be Amazon than Alibaba, or Google. But actually what's coming is that increasingly the influence, the front end of health for people is going to be online and is going to be those companies. And it's interesting to me that people started changing what they said in the magazines in Britain when journalists who tend to be in their 30s started wearing Fitbits. Well, there's a tiny step from that to managing diabetes and hypertension. And the only thing blocking it in Britain or the United States is protection, it's medical profession. But I think all those companies know it, and this is probably the next big market. So if you keep your eye on particular private, you're going to find it's a very different private that people are going to be going to. I suspect a lot of you are using Fitbits or one of the ways of monitoring. So I don't think the private sector is going to go away. I think the question that's important is how does government give itself the capacity to work in this complex environment, and what kind of partnerships, which have to include business associations and citizen groups beyond the government, can start getting some rules of the game. And if you don't, Amazon will have the data on all of you on the cloud, and you will be getting adverts as well as more coherent healthcare. So these are big issues, but I think we have to have 21st century ways of thinking about how we solve them.
Maybe you'd like to explore this topic that you are just mentioning. This changing world related to technologies, especially in health. How governments or how could we, think tanks or other institutions, could start thinking about regulations related to privacy of data. Because this new world, it seems like people are going to be their own devices to measure health and all the stuff, and we are talking about a globalized way of exchanging information that might help to improve diagnostics and whatever. So how can we thinking what should we be worried now in relation to the privacy of the personal information that we are going to share? We are already sharing. So.
Yeah, well, you've said it. But I think from where I'm standing, and the point about this talk is, particularly on those issues, you know, the company that probably will be the first in this is Alibaba, because in China already, on what they call WeChat, people have almost a cashless economy. And it's not a massive, and they've already set up a health company. It's not a massive step to see how people could start and on WeChat people are monitoring their, just like with Fitbit. One can see how it can happen. So I think the issue then is, within Brazil you have to start thinking about it. And also I think this one has to be dealt with globally. So we need to start discussions across countries about what we think about it, how to deal with it, how do we get the benefits of big data. And you know, we all know the failings of these human-based health systems in terms of referral and in terms of picking up problems. So it's not as if it won't be beneficial, but it's how can we prevent it becoming essentially a way to market drugs or diagnostic tests as opposed to for benefiting. I think those are big issues that I don't have a solution to, but I have the message is we've got to start thinking about it internally, and we've got to take a very particular idea of the role of government and the role of public and private and see that that is important, but we're in a very different environment and it's going to look different, and we need thinking about how do we regulate in this environment.
Thank you for your talk. I have studied Brazilian International Cooperation for Health, and I have seen, as you have mentioned, that's a close interconnection with the World Health Organization topics and views of how to conduct health internationally. And I would like you to comment a little bit on China's experience, because I really don't know how it works. And maybe, I don't know if you could, but on Cuban experience of international cooperation for health, because Cuba has a long-standing and it has a partnership with Brazil, with the mathematics.
Okay, I will say three things. I think the thing to understand about China is they are making major investments, and the Chinese president, when he visited Geneva, the only international organization he visited was the headquarters of WHO, and there's a statue that he gave there to commemorate it. And my impression is in WHO they are really seeing relationships shifting. And I can't predict, but my guess is that China is building the African CDC and is actively wanting to work with WHO around programs to translate a building into a mechanism for improving particularly basic health with regard to communicable disease in Africa. People who wrote about the Brazilian experience 5 years ago, it was a bit of a critique of what was called the Washington Consensus, the neoliberal world, that most ideas come from New York. But that's not going to be anymore. No one is going to have to argue that the big ideas don't come from New York. I think the issue now is how to engage with the WHO. And so rather than, I'd say to the people working in Brazil, it's time to again go back to the lessons you learned and see that it was a bit too early to bring it up, but now is the time. And I think it would be an excellent idea to speak to the Cuban government and to see the degree to which more than one Latin American country wants to share experiences and be part of whatever new model is going to emerge. I think this is an opening time, and so I think the key is actually to take your lessons now and think hard about what if it's in a world that isn't essentially driven by aid from Europe and North America, but is driven, and I think where the money comes from is quite a big issue. But I think it's time for people to start being a bit ambitious in their imaginings and in communicating it.
Well, thank you for this very interesting presentation and discussion. You don't need to be a specialist in these issues to look into the Brazilian experience to say that the SUS was very successful in universalizing the health, but not so in assuring some kind of equality in the quality of the provision of the healthcare services. How do you think these new technologies can help to solve the second problem that we couldn't do, and huge state-led services in equal societies and equal countries can do? Is there some optimism regarding these new technologies and new ways of provision of healthcare services?
Vera, why don't you put another question? Maybe you can answer that. And so
it's quite related with your question. Because in Brazil, there's a lot of things being done. Right? And you mentioned the case of China, where there's a lot of learning by doing. And despite that we have a lot of things going, and basic health is a municipal responsibility, we saw in the last years a lot of centralization and programs coming top down. You know, so where do you find this energy to really learn by doing and innovate, and how China can, the experience of China can illuminate new channels of trying?
I will take the two. We had a meeting with just now in December with some health researchers from Canada. And one of the very interesting discussions we had was that this is the moment to review and rethink the concepts of primary health care. Because the world is changing, the population is aging, the chronic disease is coming. And we used to talk about primary health care thinking simple interventions, and now it's time to think to bring technology to the primary health care. And I think this fits a little bit on what, but I think he will develop it. The second thing is, do you think China is considering seriously what we used to call health diplomacy? Because I think this is very important now in a new world, in a new international relations. What we use now, we are Ilona and Paul Goose and people used to talk about health diplomacy. When you talk about China, I see it perfectly.
So we have two more people. Maybe it's to wait to the next one, so we can answer now. Yeah. No, I think.
Two more questions.
Yeah, two more questions. Okay, so
for comments.
Gerry, I think that mutual learning is also about power relations, also about power dynamics. And I'm speaking from a perspective of a very poor country, one of the poor countries in the world, and which has a very limited capacity to negotiate, very limited capacity to influence, to share, and to learn as well. So I'm wondering, in such environment where the national health system, they have been funded by aid over years, until recently when we start seeing this shift from aid to trade. And the development frameworks, or the partnership frameworks from these countries, the most, including, the Britons, including US, the most powerful countries in the world, the frameworks are very clear. The interest is in trade, and no longer in aid. How do you see a mutual learning relationship which is balanced in an environment, in a framework which the main interest is trade rather than aid and development?
Gerry, following the big questions, difficult questions, I'd like to add another one, which is about WHO. It sounds, when you speak, it sounds quite an optimistic view about WHO. Maybe I'm wrong, but I'd like to see you, if you could elaborate a little bit more about that, because in some way what we're seeing in WHO is losing relevance. And if you see, for example, what happened in the Ebola crisis, where the UNDP led the coalition about how to deal with the problem in West Africa, because Margaret Chan could not raise the point how serious was the problem. So in some way, the organization lost the leadership in the process. And it's okay, it's African politician, no medical doctor, it's a virtue. But at the same time, we see a lot of parallel organizations growing, like BRICS Bank and other, especially bilateral cooperations coming from China. For example, now it's coming to South America, it's quite strong in Africa. So is that a good time to be very optimistic about WHO?
Okay, gosh. Okay. I think what we've concluded is basically the next 15 years are impossible. So now, in a way, I'm kind of a pessimistic optimist. I mean, it's impossible because that which was and how the world was organized is no longer has a narrative that is plausible. And it feels like things are falling apart. And in some ways they are. I guess the question is, in that opening, does something come together? And I certainly can't answer it. So I will go through this again, as I see my role, making everyone a bit more anxious about the future, but a bit hopeful that one can start thinking about solutions and new approaches. Okay, I would add to what you said is that I think the other thing we've learned is, yes, we have population aging, and yes, we're going to have periods of, particularly because of the change in the world, there's going to be periods of rapid growth, and there's going to be periods of downturn, and there's going to be big imbalances between regions. And therefore, the thought that we're going to create, now Canada is a bit privileged, it has enough room, even although it's a resource country, it can sustain and get through shocks. But yes, we're going to have all those problems plus an increasingly rapid change in economics and in the essentials to keep a health system going. So yes, we have to start thinking that the vision that, and it's a left vision particularly, that all we need to do is construct a health system by government and it will be there and solve the problems, is probably great at a certain point, but now we have to see in the face of these kind of changes, we need government to have different kind of skills, not simply building it. How, and I guess what I'd say to Denise, is you're absolutely right. We're going to have increasing competition in Africa between China and Europe and the United States. I think all parties are basically interested in economic benefit. And what I take from what you're saying is, I mean, what needs to be built in Africa now are very competent leaders and very competent negotiators. And whether governments do it or you can convince African corporates that it's essential to support something like that, I think it's by having very good leaders, good technically and good politically, that there is room, because it's going to be that which happened in the past of interventions to overturn governments is going to become increasingly difficult because there'll be a conflict between the Chinese and the Europeans, and unless they all get together on something, there will be room. But if African governments and corporates can't produce good leaders with the capacity to manage it, they'll be, it's going to be really, the countries that can't are going to be in trouble. The countries that can will probably do all right. But you have to have a different thinking of what's required, and it's that leadership that's required. And you may want to think, there's some messages there to donors and to everyone else about how to build and sustain that leadership, to manage during this period of change. Gosh, what else? Okay, I guess, and the message from China is equally applies in Europe, and in where I live now, it's obvious. I mean, if Britain can't find a way for its senior leaders to experiment and look at evidence and think about how to adapt to this changing world, we're going to be a very, very pleasant place for wealthy Chinese businessmen to come and think about the 19th century. And then go back to working in the 21st. But I don't see, I think the challenge for all countries now is how to create a capacity to adapt to a world that's changing so quickly. And since Brazil had a lot of internal capacity to experiment over the past 30 years, I think you have to convince people it wasn't just having a clear view and having a good leader that's the key. It's having people who are willing to give something a try, learn when it doesn't work, correct it, and keep on learning is the key skill. And I don't see why you should be so pessimistic that Brazil doesn't have that capacity, or pessimistic about what this organization should be offering in terms of that learning. Because countries that can't learn, will be left behind, basically. So that's going to be, that would be the message. Gosh, what else? Nation state, public and private. Okay, ICTs. I guess what I'd say about Brazil and ICTs is, I mean, there's a strong state that if it thinks clearly can regulate or form partnerships, if it thinks clearly. And that's a big plus. There's a constituency that wants to solve problems. And yes, there is a technology that can really help. But the technology can also basically help sell a lot of drugs. I mean, the technology itself is neutral. It can have many outcomes. But I'm sure if people put their mind to it, one outcome could be to make access to competent advice, delivery of drugs at home, monitoring, accessible, particularly as the problem of, I don't think it'll work very well on problems of communicable diseases in the Amazon. But in terms of non-communicable chronic disease in the cities, of course it can. But it needs someone who actually cares about meeting the needs to be working with the technology companies. And since it has to be at scale, this isn't about little pilots. It's about probably partnering with your telecoms or whatever around trying to solve problems. But you need to think through what it is, and then there needs to be enough government buy-in so that it doesn't become a facade of a program other than a reality. What else did I miss? I think that's probably as much. I think the key message still is the need to Oh, WHO. Okay. I don't know. It's true that the Chinese have created the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, and it now invests more than the World Bank. And the Belt and Road Initiative is going to be by far the biggest development investment in the world for the next 10 years. For whatever reason, the Chinese see themselves as wanting to work with a global institution. My guess is that health is amongst the least political compared to the World Trade Organization or something. It's a place where it's possible that a coalition of governments could see that it's in their interest to make it work. The African CDC will be there. I assume Tedros is doing everything he can to link it into the WHO. There are major initiatives, and I think it's an open question in the post-Washington consensus period what happens to international organizations. But I don't think the collapse of the power of the World Bank, makes it obvious that people won't use the WHO as a framework for trying to solve some global problems. I think that's, and I think the issue, Romulo, you ask it, I think there's an issue there for the Brazilian government to think about. I mean, does it want to be, who knows, it may fail, but this is the one time where the WHO is not going to be about what the aid givers pay it to do. It's going to have to come up with a new mandate and a new form of finance. And that will have to be based on a competence to actually, and yes, and the big one is to tackle the problem of health security. I think, and to be part of a coalition that tries to make that happen would be a smart place to be. It may fail. In which case what will happen is the Chinese are building infrastructure all around its periphery. It will have to create a parallel health security organization. If it doesn't want, since it's the biggest source of likely disease emergence. But I think the Chinese are willing to engage with WHO to try to solve it. And I think that's the question for others is, do they think it can be made to work? I have a clue. I'm one of the cynics about WHO. But I think this is a moment when it may be possible.
Can I just put a very quick question? It's about the political will. Because it's interesting that when we talk about the universal health coverage in here, we talk a lot about the political will, that kind of arrangement that enables some specific public managers and social movements to align and then generate this political will to create the model that today we call the SUS. But then there's also the international political will and the fact that, for instance, the global health diplomacy. Are you seeing that in terms of the Chinese model? Because right now in Brazil, there's a big question about how Brazil wants, what kind of political will Brazil wants in terms of its international engagements and how Brazil wants to be this in between inverted comma model even for this learning. There is a matter of political will, I think, that I'm not sure. Maybe there is in China, I'm not sure.
No, I will answer it differently. I mean, basically, this is growing up time. We thought the world would be kept safe basically by American organizations and them funding international organizations. And although we critiqued them, we thought that gave us a level of safety. I think the message now is it won't. So the question you're asking is, can governments start taking responsibility or not? Well, if not, just buy your mask, probably find a nice island somewhere to live in, because life is going to get really tough and it'll happen quickly. I don't think Ebola is a be all and end. We will have pandemics. We will have major problems with antimicrobial resistance. You will not want to go in for surgery. There are problems we will have. And I'm kind of old, I can be philosophical about it, but you know, if we don't, since Uncle Sam isn't going to do it for us, the question is who? I don't think Uncle Xi is going to do it for us either, by the way. If we want the Chinese to do it, then being in the periphery might not be where you want to be. So the question is there enough of an opening and an understanding now for a different way of doing global business to emerge? I have no idea. But the message I would give if it doesn't, what happened with Ebola, where still the American CDC was a key player, and it won't be. So then what's going to happen? Is Brazil, it's going to be really hard for you to close your borders. So, you know, we're in an interconnected world, and all we're asking now is, as the global order changes, where is the impetus for people to start taking responsibility? I have no idea. I can only say what's going to happen if we don't.